January 23, 1942, Liverpool, England. 19-year-old Janet Okell stands in a requisitioned building, staring at a 4 painted with a grid. Each square represents 1 nautical mile of the Atlantic Ocean. In her hand, a piece of white chalk. Around her, senior naval officers, with decades at sea, watch skeptically. They're about to learn that a teenage girl with no naval experience is better at submarine warfare than they are. Captain Gilbert Roberts adjusts his collar, knowing what's coming. At 41, invalided ashore 4 years ago with tuberculosis, he's been given command of what most admirals consider a desperate joke, the Western Approaches Tactical Unit, a wargaming center where children play with chalk while Britain drowns. But Roberts has noticed something the Admiralty refuses to see. In March 1941, 41 merchant ships sank. In June, 61 ships. In November, 13 ships went down in a single convoy. The numbers tell a story senior officers won't acknowledge. Everything the Royal Navy knows about fighting submarines is wrong. What Janet Okell doesn't know, what none of the teenage girls gathering in this room know, is that within 16 months they'll develop the tactics that turn the Battle of the Atlantic. That admirals will travel to Liverpool specifically to be beaten by them in simulated combat. That by May 1943, their chalk marks on a linoleum floor will force Admiral Dönitz to withdraw his entire U-boat fleet in defeat. The only thing that really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. Winston Churchill will write those words years later. What he won't write is that teenage girls with stopwatches saved Britain from starvation. To understand why the Royal Navy needed saving from itself, you have to grasp what was happening in the North Atlantic in early 1942. German U-boats weren't operating the way admirals expected. They weren't attacking submerged during daylight with periscopes raised. They were doing something the textbooks said was impossible. They were sneaking into convoys at night, on the surface, from behind, infiltrating the columns of merchant ships like wolves among sheep, firing torpedoes at point-blank range, then submerging into chaos before anyone could respond. By the time escort ships realized what was happening, 2 or 3 vessels would already be burning. The Wolfpack tactic was brutally effective. U-boats operated in groups of 8 to 20 submarines, coordinated by radio from Admiral Dönitz's headquarters in France. 1 boat would spot a convoy and report its position. The pack would assemble ahead of the convoy's route. Then they'd wait for nightfall and attack simultaneously from multiple directions. British convoy doctrine had been written for World War I tactics. Individual submarines attacking during daylight. Escorts were trained to protect against that threat. Not this. In January 1942, the Royal Navy had no coordinated response to Wolfpack attacks. Senior officers expected captains to use their experience and judgment, make decisions, issue orders, wait for those orders to be acknowledged and executed. By the time that process completed, the U-boats were gone, and more ships were dying. Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton, an escort commander who survived multiple Wolfpack attacks, later wrote something damning. Our doctrine assumed we'd have time to think. The Germans gave us seconds to act. Men died while we waited for permission to fight back. Captain Roberts understood the problem because he'd spent 4 years watching the Navy ignore it. Invalided ashore in 1938, he'd observed from the sidelines as the Admiralty prepared for the wrong war. They'd built more ships, developed better sonar, trained more sailors, but they hadn't questioned their fundamental assumptions about how submarine warfare worked. Roberts proposed something radical: systematic tactical analysis through wargaming, not theoretical discussions in conference rooms, actual simulations with time pressure and incomplete information. Officers making decisions under stress, then seeing the outcomes computed by assistants using naval tables and mathematics. The Admiralty gave him a building, a budget, and permission to try. What they didn't give him was experienced naval officers to run the simulations. Everyone qualified was at sea fighting the war. Roberts needed people who could calculate intercept courses, measure sonar ranges, track multiple moving targets simultaneously, and do it all under time pressure. He needed the Women's Royal Naval Service, the Wrens. Janet Okell joined WATU in January 1942, at age 19. Her father was a prominent Liverpool businessman. She'd grown up privileged, educated, and completely unprepared for what Roberts asked her to do: command submarines in simulated combat against senior naval officers. John Laidlaw arrived from Scotland with a background in chartered accountancy, mathematical precision masked by a sense of humor that led her to name the first major tactical breakthrough raspberry, as in blowing a raspberry at Hitler. The whimsy concealed deadly serious calculation. Laura Janet Howes, nicknamed Bobby, was born in Antigua, a mathematical prodigy whose computations determined whether simulated escorts would detect prowling U-boats or die in ambush. Nancy Wales was selected specifically for her understanding of team tactics from playing hockey. June Duncan would become one of Britain's top fashion models in the 1950s, but in 1942 she was calculating intercept courses and depth charge patterns. The system Roberts designed was intentionally brutal. A floor painted with a grid, players behind canvas screens with peepholes, unable to see the full tactical picture, just like real convoy commanders scanning dark seas through binoculars. Wrens, armed with colored chalk, became the hands of fate. Green marks for U-boat movements, invisible to the players. White marks for escorts. Each mark drawn and erased as 2-minute turns tick past. No pause button. No rewind. Make the wrong call, and a chalk merchant ship disappeared from the board, along with its notional cargo of food, fuel, and ammunition Britain needed to survive. Officers accustomed to measured decisions had 120 seconds to issue orders, while Wrens computed outcomes. Sonar detection ranges based on water temperature and sea state, torpedo run times accounting for target speed and bearing, starshell illumination patterns considering wind direction and cloud cover. The Royal Navy had neglected this kind of tactical study for 20 years. Now Britain's survival depended on making up for that neglect at emergency speed. The first simulations revealed something terrifying. Every tactical doctrine the Navy taught its officers made things worse. When a torpedo struck, standard procedure was for the senior escort officer to assess the situation, determine the threat axis, issue detailed orders to individual ships, then coordinate a response. This process took 8 to 12 minutes. In that time, U-boats firing from multiple bearings could sink 3 or 4 more vessels and submerge to safety. The Wrens playing U-boat commanders discovered this by accident. They weren't trained submariners. They were teenagers reading German tactical manuals and thinking about how they'd attack if they commanded a wolf pack. Then they tested those tactics against British doctrine. They won, repeatedly, methodically, brutally. February through March 1942, Wrens sank simulated convoys faster than real U-boats sank real ships, because British escort doctrine was fundamentally broken. John Laidlaw developed the breakthrough. She called it raspberry. The tactic was so simple it felt stupid. Upon torpedo strike, the attacked ship fires 2 white rockets skyward and transmits raspberry over radio. Every escort immediately converges on the convoy's perimeter and sweeps with star shells to illuminate the darkness. Any escort can initiate, not just the senior officer. Not after requesting permission. Immediately. The innovation wasn't technology, it was permission. Permission for junior officers to act on initiative. Permission to abandon the rigid command hierarchy that let U-boats exploit hesitation. When WATU tested raspberry in simulation, the results were dramatic. Response time dropped from 8 minutes to 90 seconds. U-boats caught on the surface during their attack runs, suddenly illuminated by star shells, forced to crash dive before firing all their torpedoes. Escorts arriving at the perimeter while submarines were still submerging, with sonar contact, with depth charges ready. Roberts scheduled Raspberry to be issued as official doctrine in May 1943. It was cancelled, because by then it had worked so well that Dönitz had already changed German tactics, rendering it obsolete. Success arrived faster than paperwork. But before Raspberry could reach the fleet, it had to survive one final test, the test that would determine whether the Royal Navy took WATU seriously or shut it down as a waste of resources. In November 1942, Admiral Max Horton became Commander-in-Chief of Western Approaches. A submarine ace from World War I with a reputation for aggressive tactics and intolerance for nonsense, Horton could have ended WATU with a word. Instead, he visited Liverpool to see Roberts' operation for himself. Wrens, Janet Okell, and Jean Laidlaw were assigned to demonstrate the beta search tactic by playing U-boat commanders hunting an inbound convoy. Admiral Horton took personal command of the escort group. What happened next became legend within WATU. Over the course of the morning, the teenage girls sank him 5 times. They identified his patterns, exploited his assumptions, anticipated his responses, ruthlessly punished every mistake. Horton, a man who'd commanded submarines in combat and sunk enemy warships, was outmaneuvered by women young enough to be his daughters, girls who'd never been to sea, who'd learned submarine warfare from manuals and simulations, who thought about tactics as mathematics and probability, rather than experience and intuition. After the 5th defeat, Horton stood from the plotting table and looked at Roberts. "This works," he said. "How many officers have you trained?" "About 200 so far, sir." "Not enough. I want every escort commander in Western Approaches Command through this facility, 50 officers per week. Continuous training until we've processed the entire fleet." Horton became WATU's most powerful advocate. After the war, he stated flatly that Captain Roberts and his staff contributed in no small measure to the final defeat of Germany. Admiral Sir Percy Noble, Horton's predecessor, was even more direct. "You had a great deal to do in winning the war, because if we hadn't won the Battle of the Atlantic, we should undoubtedly have lost the war." From February 1942 to July 1945, WATU trained 5,000 officers from the UK, Canada, United States, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, Poland, and Free France. They arrived weekly, 50 at a time, for intensive courses that compressed months of hard-won tactical lessons into days of simulated combat. The training was deliberately humbling. Officers commanding destroyers and corvettes, men who had survived depth charge attacks and torpedo hits, found themselves outmaneuvered by women young enough to be their daughters. The lesson was pointed. U-boat commanders were smart, aggressive, and adaptive. Tactics that worked last month were obsolete this month. Rigid adherence to doctrine would get you killed. Initiative, speed, and coordination were everything. By mid-1942, officers who passed through Liverpool returned to sea with a shared tactical vocabulary and doctrine. When convoys came under attack, scattered escorts could coordinate responses without lengthy radio exchanges. They knew the drills. They had practiced against opponents who thought like U-boat aces, because they had been trained by Wrens who had studied every German tactic and counter-tactic. The impact showed in the statistics. But first, things got worse. March 1943 was the worst month of the war for Allied shipping. Between 95 and 120 merchant ships were lost in the Atlantic and Arctic, 2/3 while sailing in convoy, the supposedly safest formation. The Royal Navy questioned whether convoy as a defensive system remained viable. The Admiralty recorded that the Germans never came so near to disrupting communication between the New World and the Old. Britain had 3 months of food supplies left. If the loss rate continued, the island would starve before summer ended. Churchill's government began planning for a negotiated peace. Then came May 1943. In a single month, 41 U-boats were lost, while sinking only 13 merchant ships, nearly 1-to-1 exchange rates that were catastrophic for Germany. On May 23 and 24, 1943, Grand Admiral Dönitz withdrew his submarines from the North Atlantic convoy routes. Admitting defeat in the campaign's decisive theater, multiple factors contributed. Very long-range Liberator bombers closed the mid-Atlantic air gap. Escort carriers provided air cover where land-based planes couldn't reach. Centimetric radar detected surfaced U-boats beyond visual range. Hedgehog forward-throwing mortars eliminated the sonar blind spot that depth charges created. But the tactics that allowed escorts to use these tools effectively came from a linoleum floor in Liverpool, developed by women the Admiralty had initially viewed as clerks and plotters. How to coordinate searches, when to illuminate targets, which unit pursues while others guard the convoy. WATU didn't just develop Raspberry, they created an entire tactical arsenal. Pineapple countered wolfpack attacks with 2-mile-wide zigzag patterns and selective starshell use. Enough light to spot U-boats without illuminating the convoy as a target. Banana replaced Raspberry for single U-boat attacks with coordinated sweeps using the latest radar and sonar. Beta Search located shattering U-boats by assuming their most likely course based on convoy movements. Counterintuitive, but it worked. Step Aside was developed in just 3 days after the first German acoustic torpedo strike on convoy ON-202 in September 1943. 2 minutes at full speed toward the attacking U-boat, then a 60-degree turn for 3 minutes. The maneuver pulled escort screws outside the acoustic torpedo's tracking cone, long enough to lose the lock. Each tactic was stress-tested in the linoleum laboratory dozens of times before being issued to the fleet. Each was refined based on feedback from officers who survived encounters at sea and returned to Liverpool to describe what actually happened versus what the wargame predicted. U-boat commanders reported to Admiral Dönitz that convoy escorts were executing coordinated responses impossibly quickly, because WATU had trained them to act on initiative rather than wait for orders from senior officers. The Wolfpack tactic depended on exploiting the confusion and communication delays inherent in 1940 and 1941 convoy operations. By 1943, those delays had been eliminated. German hydrophone operators who'd been tracking convoys from 40 kilometers away suddenly couldn't find targets until escorts were practically on top of them. Not because of new technology, because some merchant ships had been fitted with acoustic dampening systems. That innovation came from an entirely different, unlikely source. A 28-year-old American merchant ship cook named Thomas "Tommy" Lawson, who noticed something strange about the way Liberty ships sounded underwater. But that's another story. The point is that the same pattern repeated throughout 1942 and 1943. Unlikely people solving critical problems. Initial rejection from authorities, eventual validation through field testing, rapid implementation saving thousands of lives, then historical erasure of the innovators' contributions. WATU's role remained classified for decades after the war. The Wrens who developed Raspberry, Pineapple, and Beta Search returned to civilian life without recognition. Janet Okell, who commanded simulated destroyers at 19, disappeared into post-war obscurity. Jean Laidlaw's name appears in few histories. June Duncan's modeling career overshadowed her tactical innovations. Captain Gilbert Roberts received some acknowledgement, but even his role was downplayed. The narrative that emerged emphasized technology. Radar, sonar, hedgehog, aircraft. Hardware made for better post-war stories than teenage girls with chalk and stopwatches. Simon Parkin's 2019 book, A Game of Birds and Wolves, finally gave WATU its due, based on archival research and surviving records. The operational documents survived, but the voices of the women who made the decisions largely did not. Unlike their male counterparts, few Wrens wrote memoirs or gave interviews. The culture that employed their brilliance also silenced their stories. There's a broader lesson here about innovation under institutional pressure. Every breakthrough from 1942 to 1943 followed the same arc. Stage 1, rejection. Military and scientific establishments dismissed innovations that challenged doctrine or threatened established hierarchies. Admirals scoffed at teenage girls doing tactics. Stage 2. Advocate intervention. Each innovation survived because a single senior officer or scientist risked reputation to force field testing. Admiral Horton for WATU. Stage 3. Validation. Field testing proved effectiveness beyond argument. WATU-trained officers won the Battle of the Atlantic. Stage 4. Rapid scaling. Once proven, production ramped from prototype to mass deployment in months. 5,000 officers trained at WATU. Stage 5. Historical erasure. Decades passed before the public learned these stories. The Wrens of WATU vanished into post-war life. The pattern suggests institutional bias isn't incidental. It's structural. Military hierarchies evolved to enforce standardization and discipline, making them inherently conservative. The same institutions that enable coordinated operations at scale also suppress the decentralized innovation required for tactical and technological breakthroughs. The admirals who spent careers mastering naval warfare couldn't accept that teenagers with chalk might see patterns they had missed. In 1942, Britain faced existential threat. Ships burned. The mathematics of starvation were simple and terrifying. The innovations that changed those outcomes came from people the system initially dismissed. Invalid officers, teenage girls, people willing to question what everyone knew was true. Janet Okell commanded imaginary destroyers at 19 and vanished into history. The Wrens of WATU won the Battle of the Atlantic and returned to civilian life without recognition. The institutions they served survived because they succeeded. The question their stories pose is whether those institutions learned anything from merely losing everything to enemies less dangerous than their own certainty. The tactical analysis methodology Gilbert Roberts developed at WATU influenced naval warfare doctrine through the Cold War and beyond. But the broader lesson remains unlearned by most organizations most of the time. The Wrens who beat the U-boats proved teenage girls with chalk could outthink experienced admirals. 80 years later, most institutions still wouldn't believe it until they saw it. And most still wouldn't see it even then. What impossible problems could be solved today if we stopped assuming the experts have all the answers?